How many of you are actually veterans? Right? How many of you remember your drill instructors? Right? Not a group of people that you forget about, because they are instrumental in the biggest change that you would ever experience in your life. The military is very slow to make changes, very slow to make changes. I'm going to show you a couple things here to illustrate that. So if any of you have ever served in the Army or the Marine Corps, maybe even some of the Navy guys, you will recognize this. It's a poncho. This is wet weather gear, right? Very simple. If it's cold, you get a poncho liner, all right? Not very sophisticated, lightweight. It is actually pretty warm. We call them woobies. So this is actually the one that I was issued in the early 80s. This, you can see the difference in the camouflage color here. This is a more recent vintage. The military swapped that out for this. Two pieces. We went from a poncho to an extreme cold weather clothing system. Now, this is great stuff. There is no environment, no outdoor environment that you cannot be comfortable. This is a Gore-Tex wet weather gear. So that's 100% waterproof and breathable. There's also a lightweight, cold water resistant outer gear that's designed for cold, dry environments. You have your fleece jacket, you have your silk weight underwear, you have your thermal weight underwear, you have your extreme cold weather dry set. There's actually one shirt that I didn't put in here. Obviously the problem with this is carrying it. So I was an infantry soldier, and theoretically I'm going to carry everything I need to go into combat on my back. Well, I know they like us to have some guns and bullets. So what I ended up carrying was this. So a little bit of a change. Now, Leslie mentioned that I started my military career in the early 80s on active duty with the United States Army. And in addition to our drill instructors, very often we remember our recruiters, if you had one. And I don't remember mine's name, but I remember exactly what he looks like. And I remember him saying to me, and you know, son, because he was a Southern boy, you don't have to worry about polishing boots and all that kind of nonsense, because the Army's changing all that. We're not going to have polishing boots anymore. You're going to have brown, rough-out leather boots, no polishing. They're just exactly what you want. Never have to do any work with them. It was 1980. After 9/11, I called the Connecticut Army National Guard and I said, do you need any old guys? And as it turns out, about 2 years later, 3 years later, they did. So they allowed me to enlist. I was gratified on my first day at my unit when I found that some of the equipment that I actually trained on was still in use. Those brown, rough leather boots that they talked about hadn't actually happened yet. And then we had the canteen cup. So that's actually the same piece of equipment that I had in the early 80s. That's pretty much the only thing that was still the same. The first time I went into the field with my unit, they handed me some uniforms, some borrowed gear, and my platoon sergeant said, oh, Nastri, you can go down and draw a weapon in the arms room. So I went down to the arms room, and at the time, the way they had it set it up, they'd give you a weapon, and they'd hand you the bolt carrier group. So, you know, I'm just doing what I was told. I was in line, and they handed me the weapon, and I took the bolt, and I put it in my cargo pocket, and I'm walking around wondering, you know, what I should be doing next. And somebody said, hey, you can put that bolt in your weapon. I said, oh, okay. So I reached into my pocket and I took it out, and I've got my M16A4 as opposed to the M16A1 I used back in the early 80s. And I looked at the weapon and I looked at the bolt and I looked at the soldier who said I could put it in there, and I said, you know I'm supposed to know how to do this. I don't have a clue. So, which was the smartest thing I ever said, because no one made fun of me. The guy said, no problem, here, showed me how to pop it open, put the bolt in. I'm like, I sort of remember that. All right. And those brown rough-out boots, 2005, they actually happened. So I never had to polish these things again. So that started my participation in the global war on terror. That's what we call Iraq and Afghanistan. It is very similar to other wars we've had. People get shot, people get killed, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine go into bad places and do bad things. Are there any Vietnam vets in the room? All right. So to you gentlemen, I will tell you that the difference between my experience in Afghanistan and your experience in Vietnam is as follows. You were in a hot, green, wet place. I was in a hot, brown, dry place. Those are the only differences. We were operating in an environment where we had a questionable, friendly government that we were working for with a very vague mission, which, because we're good at what we do, we condensed into an actual mission that we could accomplish, as opposed to what was coming down from our National Command Authority. The gear that we used, I mentioned earlier that the military is very slow to make changes until there's a war. And then changes happen very rapidly. So as an example, one of the first things combat commanders did was they initiated what's called a rapid fielding initiative. And it was basically, we're fighting in a place we've never really fought in for an extended period of time before, so we're not really sure what you need. We know what our doctrine says we need, but we don't have all that stuff. So if there's some item of equipment that you need that's available in the private sector, here's a budget, go buy it. So as a result, camelbacks, which are very popular in athletic activities, replaced the canteen. Our unit was actually part of the 86th Brigade combat team out of Vermont, which runs the Army's mountaineering school. So before we deployed, we got commercial, these are probably $400 a pair, commercial grade mountaineering boots, which actually lasted in the mountains of Afghanistan. The issue boots would fall apart in 2 weeks. It's just too harsh an environment and this is a great item of equipment, but it's not designed for that kind of abuse. When I joined, we still had OD or woodland camouflage colors our uniforms. And then the Army decided that we needed a better camouflage pattern, so they came up with what's called the ACU, the Army Combat Uniform, which is a camouflage pattern that is designed to work in every environment, which is to say that it doesn't work in any environment, all right? It's sort of a tealish color. I had a friend of mine who worked down at Fort Polk, Louisiana, where they have the OPT-4 exercises. So, you know, we send up to division strength units to Fort Polk, where they will train against theoretical enemies. So they'll fight the Russians. Not that we would ever fight the Russians again. But all different types of enemies. And we have actors and role players. And all our guys are in woodland colors. And then all the units showing up to fight them in the woods are wearing these. And he said it was like they had spotlights on themselves. You know, you walk through the woods with this, you stick out pretty well. Now, it tended not to be a big problem, because everywhere I went when I was in Afghanistan was in a 35,000-pound armored diesel vehicle. So the extent of my camouflage was somewhat immaterial, and there were usually 9 of them in a row. So I wasn't hiding from anybody. It wasn't a big secret when we got someplace. As an infantry soldier, you know, we are designed to close with and destroy the enemy in close combat. That's our mission. Throughout all of my training, it was on the ground. You know, we were actually issued bayonets, believe it or not, because there are scenarios where you would actually be that close to the enemy that you would need that. I'm reminded of a story I just read about a Marine corporal in 2009 in Afghanistan who was doing a patrol with his unit in a local village, and they came under fire from an insurgent force. And throughout, this was close combat. You know, every village is just one rock wall lane after the other. So none of them, they don't have roofs, but there's lots and lots of walls to hide behind. So he was engaged in combat with these guys, and he was carrying a squad automatic weapon, which is a fairly robust weapon, which went cold on him, which means he either ran out of ammunition or it malfunctioned. As one of the insurgents came around the corner with an AK-47 trained on him, and he threw his squad automatic weapon, which is a pretty heavy item, at the insurgent, jumped on him, and beat him to death with his bare hands. In contrast to that, our money-making weapon was the .50 caliber machine gun, which is virtually the same weapon as was designed by John Browning back in World War I. It's .50 caliber, the round's about the size of your finger. If you've ever used one, it's exactly the same piece of equipment now. And on the convoys that we would go on, that was the main weapon mounted on all of our vehicles. One of the things that the Taliban did not want was to engage us in a firefight. I'm going to take a step back. So we get our deployment notice. Our battalion had about 650 soldiers in it, men and women. We had a support company that was mixed gender. And I will tell you right now, if there are any questions in anyone's mind about women serving in combat, I have the answer to that. They can. They're great soldiers. But we had a mixed gender unit. We were given a mission to secure a particular area in Afghanistan. Went through all of our deployment training, probably a year total, with about 5 months of full-time active duty training right before we went overseas. Arrived in country. First briefing was, that mission you guys trained for, you're not doing that anymore. You're going to a different place, doing a different thing. I was talking to some of these gentlemen earlier about some of the crazy stuff that happens, and I will tell you that whatever crazy stories you experienced when you were in the military, they're still happening. It's just different names. So, you know, like good soldiers, we had a new mission. We'll figure out how to do it. You know, it can't be that hard. And what was done is we were given responsibility for security in Lagman province in the eastern part of Afghanistan. Anywhere you go in Afghanistan, there's only one way in and one way out. There's the ring road that circles the entire country. If you're going into a village, you're going to go up into a valley. You're going to turn up into the sub-valley where the village is. You're going to turn around, come down the same road, and come back on the same road. There's no, you know what, I think today I'll go up Creamery instead of down Cornwall. That doesn't happen. There's only one way in and one way out. And the vast majority of our missions were convoy missions, whether we were going to relieve a unit in a different location, provide logistical support to them, provide presence patrols, go into an area, a valley, a village, just to show them that we can. But pretty much every single day, there were missions coming out and going back. On those convoys, as I said, we're going up and down the same road all the time. And the signature weapon in Afghanistan and Iraq is the improvised explosive device. I will say this about the insurgents: they're not lazy, they're not stupid, they lack a lot of imagination, and here's how I know that's true. You'd be driving up this road, and we're trained to look for the signs of an IED. There might be a marker on the side of the road, pile of rocks. If you're on foot, you can look for ant trails, which would be a little groove cut in the dirt where they're bearing a wire for a command detonated IED. So after a couple days, you start to see those lines going out into the valleys. And inevitably, somebody would go over a bomb. The vehicles we had, which I'll talk about in a minute, were pretty robust, and very rarely did we have any really serious injuries from that. But there's a big crater in the road where the bomb went off. So we'd hook up the truck, go back to where we came from, or drive on and continue on the mission. And then some Afghan contractors would come out and they'd repair the road. And then a night or two later, the same group of Taliban bomb barriers would come back, because that hole was easier to dig in because it had already been blown up once. They'd dig another hole and put another bomb there. So it wasn't easy, but you pretty much knew where they were going to be. So on these missions, what we discovered that one of the best ways to keep ourselves safe from these attacks, and it wasn't always just a bomb. Very often it would be a bomb which triggers a combined arms attack. So you'd have insurgents in the hills shooting down at you and RPGs flying and all sorts of exciting things like that. But our best defense against that was just to randomly stop the convoy. And when you'd have 7 to 9 trucks, and deploy your soldiers out on either side of the road. So inevitably, a mile out this way is flat, leading down to a river, and this side is going up a mountain. And you deploy soldiers up either side, and you'd sweep up the road, looking for IEDs, looking for the detonation guys who had the command detonators. They didn't like that, because if the fight started, we could then turn and maneuver on them. And we always won those fights. So just randomly stopping the truck, getting out and going for a walk was how you kept safe, which is actually what they tell us to do here too. Go out and take a walk, right? Good for your heart, keep you healthy. Same thing, same stuff. When we were in the trucks and one of these combined attacks would happen, it was usually that 50 caliber machine gun that would get us out of that problem. It had the longest range, 1.5 miles with accuracy. Very often we had what was called a CROW system, a crew remote operated weapon system. So the gun would be up in the turret, operated by a 19-year-old playing a video game inside the truck. And it was so confusing to me because I'd be sitting there looking at it, I'd get a little nauseous because there's a camera on there and it's infrared, and I'd say, how does that work? And he'd say, all right, I'll show you. And he'd put the little crosshairs on the screen, now the gun's way up here, and pointed at a rock 3/4 of a mile away. So you see it? And this is at night, so it's completely dark out. It's all through infrared. Yeah, I can see it. He presses the button and the rock blows up and disappears. So that was a great weapon to have on your side. And there's a couple of things I'm going to show you. And it kind of keeps coming back to the gear that we were issued, the movement of the Army and the military in general with making changes about things. I weigh now probably 170 pounds. When I deployed, I weighed about 175. When I came back, I was probably about 155. It's kind of hot over there. I left, it was 130 degrees. I could see snow on the mountains around us, but it was 130 degrees. When I got dressed for work, I weighed 234 pounds. I mentioned the female soldiers that we worked with, and one of the criticisms of having women in combat is that they are not strong enough to carry me off the field of battle if I get hurt. Well, I had that conversation with some of my colleagues, and I pointed out that I'm not strong enough to carry you off this field. So the best you're going to get is I'll put some bricks around you, and take all your stuff first. It's a lot of weight. This is actually a commercial version of our body armor. This is called a plate carrier. It's Kevlar, front and back. There's actually a hard plate that goes in the front and the back of this carrier. There are side plates, which gunners had to wear, pretty much no one else wore. As you can imagine, it gets pretty heavy pretty quickly. I always wore the kidney plate. I did not wear the neck yoke on this. It just got too heavy. There were shoulder plates you could put on it. And what you got in protection from fragmentation and small arms fire, you gave up a lot in personal comfort, which sounds dumb now, but meant a lot then, as well as mobility. So one of the things that I got really good at when I was deployed is pull-ups. I could take a 20-pound dumbbell between my ankles and do 20 dead hang pull-ups. And when I got there, I could only do maybe 1 or 2 pull-ups. My biggest fear, and it was probably the most legitimate fear, was that we were going to roll our vehicle. We rolled vehicles all the time, all the time. It's a terrible road system. Whatever road you're on, there's 6 inches on this side before it goes onto a field, and 6 inches on this side before it goes up a cliff. So there's a lot of opportunities to roll your vehicles, not to mention that the bombs would roll them over. But there's a lot of weight on there. This is probably the 4th version of body armor since 2001, because they just kept finding out we need to change it, we need to make it lighter, we need to make it this, we need to give more protection here. I met a doctor when I was in sniper school, and he had just come back from Iraq, and he was talking about the changes they made to the Kevlar helmet. So you probably remember the steel pots. This is probably a third of the way to the steel pot with a lot more protection to it. They started issuing these in the 80s. We used to call them the Fritz helmet because it looks very much like a World War II German helmet. Great item of equipment. By the time we were actually sending troops into combat with body armor and making it mandatory to wear body armor at all times, what they discovered was when a soldier would go into the prone, which is it's laying down, to shoot back, the body armor yoke on the neck of your body armor would push the helmet down over your eyes. Feel pretty silly, honestly. I feel kind of dumb. I can't shoot. Am I shooting at him? So the Army said, well, we can change that. And so they cut this up a little bit higher, so that stopped happening because they didn't want to take the armor off the neck. So the law of unintended consequences took effect at that point. I mentioned earlier that the signature weapon of these conflicts is the improvised explosive device, which is 99% of the time planted in the ground. And the blast effect of an IED goes up like this. So one of the effects of changing this helmet to account for someone's ability to shoot back was to make the head more vulnerable to the blast effect of the IED. And I'm sure you've read about traumatic brain injuries. At this point, everyone has. One of the reasons there are so many of those is because we had to make a decision between combat effectiveness and protection. And we chose combat effectiveness, which I believe is the right choice. But there's a consequence to all these things. On the subject of TBIs, one of the things that researchers have found is that people don't need to get hit with anything to have a traumatic brain injury. I don't know if any of you have ever been near an artillery piece when it goes off. It's really, really loud. Like, now we're shooting at them. We're not being shot at, but the blast from firing that 155 is unbelievable. You can feel the pressure on your body when it goes off, and that's just the noise. When an IED goes off, there is a concussion wave that spreads out from that blast. And that wave is enough to cause damage to a human brain. It's very soft tissue. And that's one of the reasons we have so many men and women who are in treatment in VA hospitals across the country, because it's very common. A day did not go by that we didn't have an IED go off. And I mean that quite literally. We had 7 locations, and on one of those 7 locations, there was a bomb going off that day. So that was one of the consequences of that. This is the replacement for the canteen, filled with water. A little tube comes up. That was kind of nice. Another item of the Rapid Fielding Initiative are cold weather gloves, which, if you'll recall, I said it was 130 degrees when we left, so we didn't use these a lot. But they're great. They're $700 a pair. Because it's not a glove, it's a system. And there's, I think, 5 different inserts that go in here. So pretty much anything you can imagine, any environment that you might run into, you'd be good for that. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the men and women that I was with. So we all remember Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation. If you are of that generation, he was right. If you're of the generation that came after that, he was right about you guys too. And he's right about this generation. So I'll start this segment by telling you about a little conflict my wife and I have. I've been married, I should not be hesitating at that point. And honey, if you're ever watching this, I knew the answer. I was just doing that to be funny. Almost 8 years. So we both, it's a second marriage for both of us, and I have 2 stepsons who are great kids. Great kids. They are now 20 and 22-ish. I don't know exactly how old they are, but I know they come to the house and eat sometimes, so I know that much about them. No, I'm kidding. They're great kids. But when before I deployed and after I got back, my wife always thought that my standards for the kids in the house were a little bit too high. So, you know, if I came home and there was a book bag here, I'd say, Tuck, can you come down and move this, please? Or if Bo left his football cleats in the hallway, I said, Bo, can you come get these? Well, they'll move them. I know, they'll move them now. And I was kind of relentless about it. I wasn't angry about it, I just wouldn't let it happen. And so, you know, she said, they're just kids, they're just this, they're just that. You know, you gotta let them grow up. And I said, you know what? I was in combat with kids who were younger than they are. And picking up your shoes is nothing I would ever have to say. I wouldn't even have to check their weapons. I had my life in the hands of people younger than my sons. And I was completely comfortable with it. I never doubted for a second that they would, if they couldn't drag me off the field, they'd cover me with their bodies until somebody could come get me. So the men and women that I was deployed with, who are, and by the way, of the 660 soldiers that deployed with the 102nd, here's the oldest guy that was there. I was the oldest person, until one officer from state headquarters who had been in the military for like 35 years, never had been deployed himself for about 3 months so that he could say he had a deployment. So he ended up being the oldest guy. But these young men and women are every bit as responsible, every bit as effective. They were smart. Technically, they were amazing. You know, we had all this high-tech equipment that I couldn't figure out except, so, you know, there's the start button. I got that, and then I'd find a 17-year-old come over and show me how to actually operate it. They're great. I still think of them as kids, but they were my kids. And I love them, and I trusted them, and right now, you know, there's a lot in the paper about America is declining, and this isn't the same as it was, and that isn't the same as it was. And all those things are true, not the declining part. But things are different than they ever were. And these kids are different from generations of kids before them that became soldiers and parents and business owners and veterans. But they are every bit as good as anyone else that has ever worn this uniform. And they're going to be the fabric of our society going forward. I'm going to bring this to a close in just a few minutes. I wanted to talk to you about a little bit of post-military stuff. So the VA. Anybody read about the VA lately? Anyone read anything good about the VA lately? All right. And you know what? I get treated at West Haven. Anyone else? I love those people. I love them. They take such good care of me. It's a great system. They're overwhelmed. And well, they should be. 2.5 million men and women have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. 2.5 million. 37,000 of those have been deployed more than 5 times. A third of those are National Guard and Reserve. As a percentage of the overall military carrying the weight, that's pretty high. That's pretty substantial. We're actually, the Guard and Reserve make up 48% of the combat strength of the United States military. So we can't fight a war without them. I had a young man that was with me who was an involuntary recall. So he'd been on active duty, did his time, got out, was in college. One day he gets a letter. Come on back, we need you. So as you may recall, when you join the military, there's an 8-year obligation. You may only serve 4 years of active duty, but you're in the inventory for another 4 after that. And so, like a good soldier, he packed his bag and went to Fort Benning, Georgia, and he said, you know, I think you made a mistake. I actually did my 8 years. Nope, we never make a mistake. Get out to Camp Atterbury, Indiana, join the 102nd Infantry. You're going to go to Afghanistan. So he did what he was supposed to do, and he got in a bus and came out to Camp Atterbury. He became part of our reconnaissance unit. Great soldier, great guy. About 4 months after we got there, I'm up in a guard tower one night, because I was a man of the people, and even though I had a very exalted rank of Staff Sergeant, I would occasionally take a tower shift so that the privates didn't have to go up there every night. Came up and said, Sergeant Nastri, I got a thing, I need some help. You're a financial guy, right? Yes, I am. He said, well, it turns out I was right. I did all 8 years, and they just figured it out. Really? how many deployments have you had? He said, this is my 7th. He was 24 years old. Not every deployment was a year long. Some were 6 months, 4 months, 18 months, but this was his 7th deployment at 24 years old. And I said, well, what's the question? He said, well, they gave me an option. They said I can finish the deployment or I can go home. Well, there's no question there. That's easy. He said, no, they're going to pay me an extra $500 a month for the next 6 months. That's not a good deal. How many times do you want to get shot at for $500? So he said, well, I got to think about it because I can't go back to school. I already missed the semester. I said, my advice is, you've done your time. Pack up and go home. You don't owe anybody anything at this point. The next day he comes up and he says, Sergeant Nastri, I made my decision. I said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going home. Well, good. He said, well, it wasn't really my decision. They told me I couldn't stay. Now I had to go home. So you were telling me, Frank, about these crazy things where somebody's about to get on a plane to go some bad place and they say, oh, you're going home. It's crazy stuff still happens. So I told you that story to tell you this one. I have another friend of mine who is a Vietnam vet, and he had basically the same job in Vietnam that I did. So he graduated from Cheshire High School, got a job, got drafted, did pretty well, got deployed to Vietnam. When he got there, it was a typical infantry situation where they said, okay, you're the new guy, new guys walk out front. And he said, well, to the battalion commander, he said, listen, if you let me, I think he was a staff sergeant, if you let me pick my team, I'll stay there for the whole tour. You don't have to rotate new guys in around me. Just let me pick the guys with me. And over the course of the next 13 months, his battalion didn't have one casualty, and they did not have one KIA. Came home, landed in San Francisco, took his uniform off, got on a bus, came back to Cheshire, worked here, raised a family, and I tell him, you're the luckiest human being I've ever heard of. No one is this lucky. Perfectly healthy, 65 years old, doesn't take medication, he's great shape, still works. So one day we're sitting in my office and he said, tell me something. I keep reading about all these VA claims. What is that? I've never even been to the VA. And I said, well, how long were you in combat? And he said, 13 months. I said, okay. And I told him this story about this young man. 7 deployments. That's at least 4.5 years in combat. In combat. I don't even like the word deployment. It sanitizes what happened. Now, I don't change that when I tell this story. But I went to war. I didn't go on a deployment. It wasn't a trip somewhere. It was a war. People got killed. People got hurt. It was a war. And these young men and women are going over and over and over again. So I don't know how many trucks he rolled over. He never got shot, never had a penetrating injury. But there's no question about it. No body can put up with going from 170 pounds to 230 pounds and hiking up and down mountains all day and getting in and out of trucks without getting hurt over the course of 4.5 years. It's very easy to get broken doing that. When you go down to the VA, you can see the sign right up front. It says the price of freedom is visible here. And that's absolutely true. Our World War II veterans are dying at a rate of 1,000 a day, which is a tragedy, but it is a function of time and age. So it is sad, but there's nothing wrong with that. Veterans are dying at a rate of 22 a day to suicide. 22 a day, every day, to suicide. We lost 1 soldier in combat, 1 KIA, out of 660. 1. We've lost 5 to suicide since we came home. 5. And that's right here. New Britain, Waterbury, Old Saybrook. One was a prison guard in Niantic, and I honestly don't know where the other one lived. I didn't know him that well. 5 to suicide since we came home. Why is that? I don't know. I don't think it's because there's some moral flaw in the men and women that we're sending overseas anymore. I think it's the constant pace, the repetition. It's going to weigh on a human being. It's especially, it's a much more egregious problem among the reservists than it is active duty. Active duty, when you come back from the war, you land, get out of the plane, you get in the same line next to the same guys that you were in 7,000 miles away. When they dismiss you at the end of the day, you go to your barracks or your home, the next morning you're back out in the parade field with the same guys. So if something's going wrong, there are people right next to you to notice that. And they do, there's a lot of training that goes on. On the reserve side, you come home, that plane lands, you get off it, mom and dad, your wife, your kids are there, everyone hugs and kisses, get in your car and go home. And the next morning you get up and you look around and you wonder when you're going to hear something go boom. For most people, that goes away, but not for everybody. So, I've touched on a ton of stuff tonight. I'm sorry if I was all over the place. I appreciate you listening to this. I think what I was trying to get out is that your experiences when you were in are still going on. It's the same crazy stuff. You do your best. You do what you can to make that mission happen. You change. I don't think anyone in my unit did what they were trained for, or what their job was. They may have been trained for, but I was supposed to be this, and I ended up as that. I wasn't doing forward artillery observing. I was doing something else. You adjust, and these men and women do that. So now we are once again in a shooting war. Anyone notice that? Right? It's nobody on the ground shooting yet, but it's a shooting war. So the things that we thought could never happen again are happening every single day. I'm proud that I was able to serve my country in uniform. Our Veterans Memorial, I just got the brick that's right between my dad and my brother. So we have Korea, First Gulf War, and Afghanistan. I've done a few things in my life that I'm reasonably proud of. None of them compared to wearing that uniform. I'm proud to be a veteran with you. I'm proud to be an American. I appreciate you giving me this opportunity to come down tonight and speak with you all. So thank you. Oh, yeah, sure, Leslie, go ahead.
Two separate ones.
Okay.
One, I was just at a meeting and we had Mark Owen there, that's his alias, from one of the Navy SEALs when they killed Afghanistan. And I asked him the same question I'm going to ask you about the rules of engagement.
Yep.
Because we realized that. I mean, his opinion was like a lot of them, that it's just tied the hands so bad of our combat soldiers, and then it's lowering the morale, lowering everything.
Yeah.
Because especially the Afghan and the Middle East, those people they're fighting against know how to deal with that very effectively. Did you have any experience with that?
Yeah, the rules of engagement were an issue because we're the good guys, and we tend not to try and do things that are going to cause unnecessary damage. So we're supposed to use proportional force. Our rules of engagement were, number one, you always had the inherent right of self-defense. Like there was no regulation, law, rule, order that could change that. If your life was in danger, you can defend yourself. In fact, when I was working as our operations NCO, one of my jobs was to take the briefings from the units that were going on convoys, on patrols. And they'd come in and they'd give me their manifest and where they're going and who's going and their equipment list and all that stuff. I'd give them their intelligence briefing and what artillery assets, what air assets they had. And as I walked the commanders out of my building, there was what's called a GTA, a graphic training aid, which the Army is great for. And what this was is this big fold-out with all these different scenarios on it with pictures. And the last picture up here was of a suicide bomb. And the picture was a guy dressed in loose clothing, traditional kind of Middle Eastern looking fellow, sweating. And it said here, this is what to watch out for. Guy in loose clothing, sweating, wearing perfume. If you see this person, you can assume he is a suicide bomber, and you are authorized to use deadly force. And I said, and I tell him, none of the orders that you've received about your rules of engagement will ever change that. You have the inherent right to protect yourself. That's not just your personal physical self. When you're in a convoy and you're in a truck and you see a threat to that truck, respond to that threat. Don't call and ask permission. Just do it. And I'm sure Mark Owen or whoever that Navy SEAL was had similar rules. Now, you'd be on a convoy, you'd start taking fire from a hillside next to a building. You call for artillery or air, whatever was most available. So, this is me, I've got a target at such and such location. And 5 echelons up, there's a guy looking at a computer screen with a drone camera on it saying, oh, no, we can't use artillery on that. And they would deny the artillery mission. So what do? You drive through the ambush, you deploy and you run up the hill. It was not a very clean situation. I don't think it's dramatically different from most conflicts. I mean, I wasn't in Vietnam. We certainly don't have free fire zones where we are now. But it is what it is. There's a little bit of a Disneyland thought process. We're the good guys. We don't break things that shouldn't be broken.
I think some of it was like when you were going into clear a village or see what was going on. When you go in, they knew if they didn't have a weapon, and even if you knew that person in that housing or whatever was someone who's been shooting at every American or everybody, and every ally going around, and you knew that, but you couldn't go in and do anything or arrest them because they knew enough not to have their gun or weapon or anything in their hand, because they knew that we cannot do anything based on that.
So this is the most obscene story I can possibly tell. It's not dirty, it's just a terrible situation. All right, sorry, Jim, it's not dirty. I'm not going to tell you a dirty joke up here today. So, to this question, the first time we got shot at was a mortar attack on our FOB, our forward operating base. And we had amazing intelligence, amazing. So by the time I got from my bunker to the operations center, and I'm talking about wearing PT shorts and carrying everything in my hands, and we got inside, our intel guys were on their cell phones with some local interpreters, and they knew the names of the people who had shot at us. That's pretty amazing. I mean, we're talking 5 minutes, right? They also knew where they were. So we sent out a convoy to go after them. We called in air, and I ended up in one of the guard towers, looking off into the distance where one of these groups was hiding, or so they thought, behind a wall under some trees. Now, one of the pieces of equipment that I have here is called a Firefly. So a Firefly is a 9-volt battery with a little plastic cap on the top. And when I put that cap on the 9-volt battery and drop it in my pocket, even if it's inside, what it does is send out an infrared signal. So anyone who's using night vision devices, which we all had on our helmets at all times, that's what this plate is for. There's a night optic that goes on here. So after dark, you just drop that down, and that's what you're looking at. So if I have one of these in my pocket, anywhere on my person, I'm going to glow. It's like this throbbing glow. The combat flags we use, if I have this on my shoulder and someone's looking at me through infrared vision, this glows. So don't shoot that guy. If he's glowing, don't shoot him. It's okay. So I'm up in this guard tower, and I know that there are small helicopters with gunships flying overhead. I know where the bad guys are, and I can see their targeting devices like a ray gun in a science fiction movie. So they're just hanging out up there. These bad guys are under these shrubs, and I can see their targeting lasers going right down on them. And I looked at the guy next to me, and I said, "Do you think they know? Do you think they know it's coming?" And 2 seconds later, they opened up with their miniguns, and that was it for those guys. But there was I'm sorry?
I said vaporized.
Vaporized, pretty much. It was they call it the pink mist. So there was another group that had taken off into a village. So our convoy that went out to get them captured one of them. And to Sergeant Ramos's credit, he was going room to room and saw this guy laying down. He had been wounded, and he didn't shoot him, which he would have been completely justified to do. They captured him. So now we've got a wounded insurgent. And we called in a medevac. We treated him. We put on the medevac. We had a young sergeant go up to Bagram Hospital with him. So they get him up to the hospital. They treat him just like any other patient. They bring him in. They treat him. They operate on him. And I've got this 23-year-old E5 sergeant up there with him who doesn't know what else to do. He keeps going up to somebody in authority saying, what do I do with my prisoner? I'm like, we don't know. We just take care of him. We're just going to treat him. And finally, he got a hold of one of our NCOs that was up in Bagram. And now, Sergeant Washington, we called him Big Dub. There was Sergeant Washington, 6'4", 300 pounds, and then Sergeant Washington, 5'8", 120 pounds. Big Dub, Little Dub. It was Big Dub that he got a hold of. So Big Dub comes storming in. He's like, what's going on here? I want somebody to take possession of this guy. And he starts going up the Afghan and the American chain of command. And we're only permitted to hold prisoners for 24 hours. 24 hours is up. And the Afghans didn't want him. Now, we captured this guy in combat after he shot at us, and no one would take him. We can't, and they won't. So we put him on a helicopter and flew him back to our FOB, where the local version of the CIA, the Afghan CIA, came, questioned him for a couple of hours. And I should add that when you think of the Afghan CIA, think of the Beverly Hillbillies. It's not a real sophisticated group. They take him, question him for a couple of hours, and the next day, he was back working in his cell phone shop in downtown Methodlawn. So, our chaplain, we're having a conversation about this completely unclean scenario, and our chaplain, who is a Catholic priest from Connecticut, said, your mistake was taking prisoners. And I said, Father, he said, tomorrow he's going to do it again, and he's going to kill one of your friends. And this terrible, stupid situation is going to happen all over again. Now, I argued with him then, I would argue with him now. That's a terrible situation to find yourselves in, but it happens. So, and you know, thank you for bringing that up. So in my life, well, since 2003, I have never heard, I've never mentioned the fact that I was in the military without somebody saying, hey, my nephew's a Navy SEAL, or my neighbor's son's cousin is a Navy SEAL. The Navy SEALs are the smallest combat unit in the United States military. But it turns out everybody knows one. How does that happen? I never get, my cousin's kid is a pimply-faced, braces-wearing private in the Iowa National Guard who drives a truck. Do you know him? I never get that. I'm teasing.
I noticed you said when you put all the equipment on, you're about 235 pounds. Now, do you get into the vehicle with that?
Oh, yeah.
Now, when you're in the vehicle, I'm going to ask a crazy question. Is it air conditioned?
It is. Vehicles that are not air conditioned are deadline. You can't take them out because you die. So it's interesting. We drove MRAPs, mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles. I'm sure you've seen them. They're huge. They're the size of a garbage truck. The up-armored Humvees, if they went over the IEDs that we had, they would just vaporize. You couldn't put enough armor on them.
What do you think about the police now? They're offering these vehicles to the civilian police and everything. There was one in the paper just yesterday. Do you think that's a good idea to have those vehicles?
I do. And what's the downside? You can't shoot at me. You know, we'd be in the trucks and they'd be shooting small arms at us. And we just, hope that they didn't have RPGs or something like that, because it doesn't matter. You shoot at me all day long. More protection is better. My brother's a police officer. He's been one for 16 years. I want him to be as protected as he possibly can be. And there was actually another article last week about that same program giving weapons and vehicles to schools. So the headline is, should the government be giving M16s and grenade launchers and MRAPs and so forth to schools? What they didn't say is it's going to school systems that have their own police departments. So some out west and the West Coast, and the Southwest, there are school systems that actually have their own police departments. That's who's getting those pieces of equipment. Why would that be bad? Except that people get all squirmy when they read about it in the paper. So the vehicles that we operated in we had 3 different kinds. One had great suspension, terrible seats. One had great seats, no suspension whatsoever. So the end of a 9-hour convoy, so we're going 3 miles up the road, should take about 45 minutes. The next morning when we actually get there, it can be a little rugged. So I got very lucky when we actually got to the FOB. They said, Sergeant Nastri, you're getting a vehicle for the colonel, because that was my job. I was his bodyguard and I got my own vehicle. I said, oh great. And he said, but It's not one we've ever worked with before. It was called an MATV. And we went over, and it looks like a spaceship, and I went inside, and all I cared about was the fact that the seats were webbing and suspended, and it didn't matter if it had good suspension, because I just bounced like a space. I love this. Now, so remember the law of unintended consequence? It was the best vehicle to drive in. It was comfortable, easy to drive, it had all this technology in it. The problem was that 50 caliber machine gun up top that was so important didn't have any place for ammunition. So if there was a fight, the guys inside are like, hang on, I got some for you. So remember the story about the engineers on Omaha Beach jury-rigging their vehicles to put some kind of device on the front so they could cut through the hedgerows, right? Right? So there's actually a young man from town here named Steve Davis. He was in charge of our maintenance section. I went to him, I said, Sergeant Davis, like, what are we going to do? I can't give up my truck. It's so comfortable. And I said, but, you know, we've got to have some bullets up there. Don't worry about it. Leave it with me. And the next day, they had welded ammo racks all the way around the outside of this thing. Just that day. They're ingenious. Love Sergeant Davis. Every time I see him at Stop and Shop, I give him a big kiss. Mr. White.
Dave, if I understand you correctly regarding women in your unit, they were actually in combat in the vehicles with you going out?
Absolutely.
And when you stopped and went up the hillside and down the valley,
Yep.
they were fully armored,
Yep.
carrying their M16?
Yep. With the exception of my driver, who's from Southington, and was Jen Zeta.
This is absolutely astounding to me because I have this distinct impression that our Pentagon, the Department of Defense has said there are no women in combat.
There are no women in combat military occupational specialties. So there's no infantry females, though Ranger School is now opening up to women. So that's the MOS, right? You're whatever you do. I was a 13 Fox, which is forward observer, 11 Bravo, I was infantry. There are no combat arms women. So the women that we were with were truck drivers, mechanics, medics, cooks. The #1 gunnery score, that's the 50 caliber machine gun on the gunnery range before we deployed, out of 660 soldiers was a female cook. And she was my gun. Because Mrs. Nastri's little boy needs to be taken care of. So they were great soldiers. Yes, sir.
Were you issued a cup?
Like
You said you wore the water bag, and you held up a cup and said, that's old-fashioned.
I carry, you know, we were issued these. These are still issued units, and they're probably the same ones everybody carried in World War II. There's no difference. Remember the canteen? No, I put it in one of, I had all sorts of pouches, mostly filled with candy. Occasionally a bullet or something like that. Yeah, but I would put it in there, and I would actually put other things inside.
I was gonna say, you might as well stick a canteen in it, and you're all set.
Well, it's, you know, our rations were the MREs, meals ready to eat, so they're just envelopes that you tear open. So it really was a little bit different. One thing that I got rid of shortly after I got over there was the fragmentation grenades. So when we get there, it's the first time, it's like, okay, go equip yourself for a fight. So you go into the arms room, and I had an M9 pistol and my M4 rifle. Now, I need some of these hand grenades. I need some of these smoke grenades. I need some bullets for all this stuff. Do you have any mines? No, we don't need mines. You're not giving us mines? No, you're not getting any mines. You sure? Because I know how to use the mines. No, you're not getting any mines. Okay. So I got all this stuff, and I'm outfitting myself. My 235 pounds might have been 260 at that point. I had a lot of stuff on me. I was ready for a gunfight. And the next day I go, oh, my back. Oh, maybe I should just get rid of some of these. I don't need all these bullets. Private, are you going to carry some extra bullets? Yes. Okay, good. You're good with the bullets. But the fragmentation grenades are 1-pound balls of steel. And I have 2 really bad shoulders. So I'm absolutely convinced when I was like, if I try and throw this, I'll probably blow myself up. So I think I'll put those away too. The smoke grenades I'm fine with. I can just hold those. That's easy. So, yes, sir.
We leave here tonight, we're well informed. We watch television or read a piece of paper. We know a lot from you.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
Thank you for being such a wonderful speaker.
Oh, thank you.
Maybe give you this reward so that you can remember us by.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, everyone. Thank you.